Until recently, the history of Dyker Heights, Brooklyn, New York was lost to history, overshadowed by that of Bay Ridge and our ever-growing Christmas light displays. However, back in 2006, I had an opportunity to unearth the history of Dyker Heights, and this enabled me to write my college thesis on the subject. Although not easily available, the amount of information I found with the help of friends was immeasurable, and I've been sharing it ever since. In 2013, filmmaker Angelo Bonsignore asked if we could make an informal short on Dyker Heights, our hometown. The 15-minute short ballooned into an unscripted, hour-long documentary. We tried to present as much credible information as accurately as possible, but as technology advances and makes available more century-old information, the material presented will be refined, and additional information may be unearthed to share. I'm indebted to my family, neighbors, historical societies, and relatives of long-lost original Dyker Heights homeowners for countless pieces of information, stories, maps, and photos. However, if you have anything to share or want more information, please send an email to me at historian@DykerHeightsCivicAssociation.com. We hope you enjoy our film. It was fun to make. Hi, I'm Christian Zaino. I'm the historian at Dyker Heights, Brooklyn, New York, which many of you know to be a Italian-American residential community with a little bit of suburban flair that's famous the world over for Christmas lights. But there's a little bit more to the story of Dyker Heights than just Christmas lights, which I was actually able to uncover while I wrote my thesis in the spring of 2006. And I'd like to share it with you. But before we talk about Dyker Heights, we really should talk about Utrecht, which was the original town established by the Dutch in southwest Brooklyn, and what better place to do it than right here at the Utrecht Dutch Reformed Church. The Utrecht Dutch Reformed Church was established in 1677, a few years after the colony was established in 1657. Initially, a man named Cornelius van Verkoven was supposed to establish the colony, and that was in 1652, but he went back to Holland to get some recruits, and he died in Holland, so he couldn't do it. His protege, Jack Cortelyou, was the one who established the Utrecht, which received its charter in 1657. So this Gothic Revival church was built in 1828 from the stones of the original church, which was built 2 blocks away on 84th Street and 16th Avenue, which at the time when it was built in the year 1700, it was actually just King's Highway. And this strip of 84th Street was the main town square. Now, the original church was built in 1700. It was demolished in 1827. The stones of that church were moved 2 blocks away to where we are right now, and they built this new church in 1828. It was actually one of the first buildings landmarked by the city of New York in 1965. When the church was being constructed in 1828, the stonemason's work was inspected by General René Edward de Russy, who at the same time was also building Fort Hamilton, as well as James Cropsey of Cropsey Avenue, which is just down the block. The two became very friendly, and General de Russy purchased some land from him on the hill a few blocks away, which became Dyker Heights. The church was organized in 1677, and it still functions to this day. The Friends of Historic Utrecht, the historical society in the neighborhood, actually has done painstaking work to restore this building. It's actually one of the oldest buildings in the city and the oldest one in this neighborhood, and it's the last remnant of the Dutch town of Utrecht. In 1657, Jack Cortelyou established the Dutch town of Utrecht, which he named after his hometown in Holland. It was actually the youngest of the 6 towns that made up Kings County. And he laid out about 20 farms that stretched all the way from the Bay to about 60th Street, from what became 16th Avenue to 20th Avenue. So Jack Cortelyou's claim to fame was that he drew the Castello Plan, which was the first detailed map of Manhattan in about 1660. At that same time is when he laid out Utrecht. And the folks of the town cultivated grain to supply the markets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. However, once the Erie Canal opened, all the grain came from the Midwest because it wouldn't spoil in the transit to reach the markets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. So the shift in agriculture was from the cultivating of grains to the cultivating of vegetables. So all the farms became market gardens to supply the markets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. However, market gardening doesn't require flat lands, so the hilly areas of Dyker Heights, which remain common woodland, were developed into market gardens. And Miss Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt of Flatbush wrote in about 1880 about this phenomenon, which he called market gardening. Quote, changed the whole character of farm work on this island. Flatbush farmers, being so near to the city, began to raise those vegetables which were to supply the markets of New York and Brooklyn. Where formerly wheat, rye, buckwheat, oats, corn, flax, and barley were the products of the farm, with only so much of cabbage, peas, potatoes, and turnips as were necessary for the family use. And all this is now reversed. Only so much hay and grain as the farmer needs are raised, while he depends upon his market produce for sales. So she illustrates beautifully the change, the shift in agriculture from grain to market garden. And about 20 years after she wrote this, real estate pressures grew, and the market gardens were then developed into real estate developments. And here we are in the corner of 84th Street and 16th Avenue in front of the New Utrecht Dutch Reformed Church's cemetery, which had its first recorded burial in about 1650. It's on the westernmost edge of the town of New Utrecht. The church behind me is a Baptist church. It actually has nothing to do with the cemetery, but that's the spot of the original octagon church, which was built in 1700 for the church that was established in 1677. That octagon building was demolished in 1827. The stones of that church were moved a few blocks away, and the new church that we were just in front of was built in 1828. There's a few buried in here that some of you may recognize. Benson of the Benson Farm of the Bensonhurst development is in here. Cropsey of Cropsey Avenue is also in here. So there are many famous people, in this neck of the woods anyway, that are in the cemetery. It's still used to this day, and it has been maintained by the Friends of Historic New Utrecht, and recently the grass was cut by the Boy Scouts. We're standing on the corner of 82nd Street and 11th Avenue at Walter L. Johnson Corner, which was named for Mr. Johnson, who was the developer here at Dyker Heights. And we're standing in front of where his home used to be. This is actually a third home on this lot. And Mr. Johnson built his first home in about 1896 after he named Dyker Heights in about October of 1895. So in about 1896, he opened his home right here. It was on a very massive lot. It went about 160 feet down 82nd Street and about 200 feet to 83rd Street along 11th Avenue. The next few homes were built in about 1928 or so, and they replaced the home of Mr. Albert Edward Parfit, who was actually the original architect of Dyker Heights. And his home was also in a very large lot, about 100 feet down the street and another 200 feet down connecting to 83rd Street. And the last home that was the original home built here at Dyker Heights, which is actually still there. It's clad in white and blue brick. Is the home of Mr. Tuttle. And Mr. Tuttle was, at the time, in the late 1890s, very important in the water department here in Brooklyn, the city of Brooklyn at the time. And he later on became extremely influential in the city of New York and became, as I like to call it, the pre-Robert Moses. Anyway, Mr. Johnson's house, the first home he built in about 1896, burned down in about 1900. The second home he built also caught fire and the fire was extinguished, but the second house actually did succumb to flames a few years later, in about 1902. Walter Johnson actually had some money trouble, and I think that burning the house down and collecting a lot on the insurance was a way that he can get the money back. Most of the information I got on Dyker Heights came from the Brooklyn Eagle, which is online from about 1855 to about 1902. After 1902, it's microfilm and even microfiche, so I haven't looked at those. But the story of Mr. Johnson goes cold at about that time. Exactly why he went bankrupt is a little peculiar to me, because he made so much money and the print press was so lavish with praise regarding to all the beautiful homes that he built further down this way. In September of 1899, the Wall Street Journal reported, Dyker Heights and Wall Street, quote, of all the newly developed resident districts of Greater New York, Dyker Heights is probably the most easily reached. Its magnificent transportation facilities commend it to the busy man of Wall Street. It can be reached via the 39th Street Brooklyn Ferry and 86th Street Nassau Line in 45 minutes. It would almost seem that the transportation companies had arranged their facilities in anticipation of the prominence that Dyker Heights is now attaining. Dyker Heights is located upon beautiful rolling ground overlooking picturesque New York Harbor. The 45-minute trip between Dyker Heights and Wall Street by water and rail is as invigorating as the Dyker Heights climate is health-giving. The rare opportunities afforded by Dyker Heights to the wealthy and those in moderate circumstances are largely due to the energy, enterprise, and good taste of its founder, Mr. Walter L. Johnson. When Dyker Heights initially was built, most of the homes were about on 82nd Street, further down to 86th Street. However, as you can see by the massive stone piers, it started about at 79th Street and went all the way down to 86th Street from 10th Avenue all the way to 13th Avenue. So here we are outside of Mr. Tuttle's house, which is now known as 1050 82nd Street. And this house was also designed by Mr. Parfit, who's the architect, built by Walter Johnson, the developer, and the first, I guess you could say, customer of Dyker Heights development was Mr. Tuttle, Arthur Smith Tuttle. He, born in 1865 and died in about 1949, he was the engineer of the water supply, the City Works Department of the City of Brooklyn at the time when he purchased this house after graduating from NYU School of Engineering in about 1886. He later became the chief engineer of the City of New York, and he was the man who started actually the Triborough Bridge, which was finished, of course, as you all know, by Robert Moses. He was also president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Today the house is obviously a lot different. No longer has the main smokestack in the front of the house. It's clad in white and sky blue brick. Back in the day, the house was covered in lots of shingles, as was the style of the homes here in Dyker Heights, which was basically Queen Anne style and also that of the shingle style. Mr. Parfit's house, the architect, his house is mainly of the shingle style as well, having a large tower at the back of the home overlooking the bay. So here we are standing outside of 8205 11th Avenue, and these pair of homes were built in about 1979 and replaced the home of Mr. Frederick Henry Johnson, who was Walter Johnson's father. Now, they purchased the home and the about 8 acres of land on which Dyker Heights was built from the widow of Brigadier General Rennie Edward de Russy of the United States Army, who is very famous in this neck of the woods because he's the one who built Fort Hamilton. And they had purchased the home in about 1888. Unfortunately, Fred Johnson died of a massive heart attack in about 1893, so that's how Walter, his second son actually, decided that he would take over the family business, which was real estate, and he would design Dyker Heights. So I believe that Fred was the one who purchased the land in order to build Dyker Heights, but since he died, his second son was the one who took over. Now, actually, the home was known as the Lookout by the Brooklyn Eagle because it had a very large, about 3-story tall tower on the southern end of the home, which afforded the viewer uninterrupted panorama of the New York Harbor all the way from Sandy Hook to the Palisades. Now, according to the Brooklyn Eagle, this was the home also of General de Russy. However, there's a map I have from 1890 which shows the home, or a house, in the middle of the intersection. Because at that time, there weren't any roads except for one, King's Highway, which started, in this area anyway, at about 84th Street, 14th Avenue, and it curved up to where about St. Phillips is, and it curved all the way down to where P.C. Richards is today, and then headed all the way down to the fort on Fort Hamilton Parkway, which at the time was called Fort Hamilton Avenue. Anyway, so it's unclear to me if the Johnson family moved the house from the middle of what would become the intersection to this area here, or they demolished the home and built a new one. So that's lost to history, but nonetheless, this was the first home built at Dyker Heights. Although it wasn't built for Dyker Heights, it was in a very different style, Italianette, very minimal ornament. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Frederick Johnson, lived in. Unfortunately, it was demolished in about 1979. So, General de Russy purchased about 8 acres of land from Mr. Cropsey in about 1832 for about $375.25, according to the registrar's office here in Kings County. and he built his home, which became in the middle of the intersection here, and it afforded him a clear view all the way from Sandy Hook to the Palisades. At about that same time is when he built Fort Hamilton. So I think that he purchased this land because it's the highest land around, and he could be in his home looking not only at over the harbor, but also making sure the British aren't trying to sneak a fast one pulling into the harbor. If he were going to see the British, he can hop on King's Highway with his horse, which would be about 81st Street over there, and ride his horse in about 5 minutes time down to the fort and let them know the British are coming, because he was about 110 feet off sea level right here where we're standing, and then maybe another 3 stories up, so about 150 feet off the ground, had a clear view. And I think it was a strategic decision for him to purchase the land, to build the house, to defend the harbor from the British. So here we are on 79th Street and 11th Avenue, which was the northern edge of Dyker Heights when it was developed in about 1896. And we're standing in front of the last remaining piers, 2 on this side of the street and 2 on that side of the street, which were the more of the ceremonial entranceway here in Dyker Heights. Virtually every single entranceway around Dyker Heights had piers similar to these, and you can see one remaining pier on the 86th Street entranceway of Dyker Heights. And I'm so glad when these homes were built, these are not original Dyker Heights homes, these are infill homes built many years later, that the developer didn't actually demolish them. And the homeowners here today and across the street did a very beautiful job preserving them for the community, and I very much admire that. So in September of 1899, the Wall Street Journal wrote another article on Dyker Heights. And actually they wrote many articles on Dyker Heights, as did the Brooklyn Eagle and the New York Times. And I just wanted to quote the article, which was entitled "An Ideal Spot for a Home." And from that article you can see the exclusiveness of Dyker Heights and why it was so desirable. Quote, "One who visited 3 years ago what is now called Dyker Heights can fully appreciate that Mr. Walter L. Johnson, the founder, is entitled to the credit of the transformation that has taken place. For the cabbage and cornfields of a short time ago are now replaced by massive stone piers and heavy wrought iron lamps and scrolls which give an air of exclusiveness to the whole place. 3 years ago there was not a street open through the property, and no improvements of any kind, though nature had done everything possible to make it attractive, and it is without rival as to location, situated as it is an elevation of 150 feet above the sea level, and is directly opposite the new Dyker Meadow Park, now being laid out by Kings County, which will be the only seaside park in Greater New York. The property has been graded, gas, water, and electricity introduced, sidewalks laid, and over 100 dwellings erected, mostly all now fully occupied by owners. These changes and improvements have succeeded each other so rapidly as to fairly startle the natives, and even those who first purchased at Dyker Heights can hardly realize the great change of scene that has taken place." It's no longer here, it's no longer operational for a gas lamp, but you can see the housing mechanism here in this stone pier, which is beautifully preserved by the homeowner. But back in the day, you would have a very large glass lamp filled with gas light, and it would be a very beautiful entranceway into Dyker Heights. And of course, virtually every single entranceway in Dyker Heights had a similar set of piers, and the only other remaining one left is on 86th Street and 11th Avenue. So now we're standing in front of St. Phillips, which when it was built in about 1900, it was known as St. Phillips by the Sea. And in order to raise funds to build the church, the members of the community had weighing parties, which was essentially a cocktail party that when you arrived, you stepped on the scale, and whatever your weight was, you had to pay 1 cent per pound. So that's how they raised funds for the church. So St. Phillips actually opened Easter Sunday, 1900. Mr. Johnson's sister, Delia, his only sister, actually got married here to a man by the name of Leonard Smith. Now, Mr. Smith's mother also had a house here in Dyker Heights, and they got married on April 10th, 1901. Fast forward about 17 years, their oldest daughter, Miriam, died in 1918. And in 1918, there was a very large flu epidemic in the United States, and she actually died, along with actually Walter Johnson's mother, Jane. She also died. And actually, in the apse of the church are 2 windows, Tiffany-made windows, that are dedicated to the memory of Miriam Smith. And actually, when I had spoken to the church people here a few years ago, they had no idea who the windows were for, and I told them. So they were very pleased. Initially, the drawings of the church were by Mr. Parfit, and the church was supposed to be much larger. The piece we see here, all the way on the right of the screen here, was the first part built, and it was actually supposed to be a walkway between the very large church, which was supposed to be to the right, and a very large house for the reverend. Of course, those weren't built. In about 1910, they built the apse and the little transept over there, as well as the little steeple. And it was actually clad over in that random ashlar stone veneer in about 1950. But if you walk inside, it's all very pretty, very nice reredos and beautiful woodwork throughout the whole building. Very nice. Here we are outside of 1067 84th Street. This home, which was also known as the dwelling house, was the house in which St. Philip's was established. I believe it was built initially as a schoolhouse by Walter Johnson, or at least a home to house the workers who built the homes for the residents. That's why it's very different from all the other homes in Dyker Heights. You can see it's very small, it's not elaborate, and it's very close to the street. There's actually a very funny story with this house that the Brooklyn Eagle reported, although when they reported it, it wasn't very funny. The Brooklyn Eagle explained, quote, "The property, which at the time was owned by Walter L. Johnson, was occupied by an Italian family, to whom Mr. Johnson paid $600 to vacate it in order that the neighborhood of Dyker Heights, which is very carefully restricted, might have no objectionable features about it." So clearly, Walter, he didn't like Italian people, although two of the nicest homes were owned by Italians and now we're surrounded by Italians. So Mr. Lorenzo Yulo purchased this stately home at 1046 83rd Street from Walter Johnson in about May of 1897. I don't know how much he paid for the house, unfortunately, and I don't know who designed it, but since it's a very old home, it was probably designed by the first architect, Mr. Parfit. Now, Mr. Yulo was born in 1841 in the island of Malta. He was married there. He also went to school and college there, and he actually became a lawyer. And he was actually involved in the steamship lines bringing immigrants from Italy to America. And he came to America about 1893, where he became the legal advisor to the Commissioners of Immigration in the Port of New York. His first wife actually died in the home in about 1900. And Mr. Yulo actually remained in the home until he died in about 1915. Of note, he also, as his obituary claims, promoted the welfare of Italian immigrants. He was involved in the managers of the Catholic Protector, actually, whatever that is. He was also a member of the Catholic Club as well. He's actually the second resident of Italian descent in Dyker Heights, the first being, of course, Mr. Saida. And here we are on the corner of 83rd Street and 11th Avenue in Dyker Heights in front of the Gorga Brothers home, which was built in about 1924 by Alfredo Palermo for the Gorga family that were involved in produce. The home that preceded this was owned by Walter Johnson's business associate, Frederick Connor Dexter, who by all accounts in the newspaper had the most expensive home in Dyker Heights, costing about $40,000. Now, Mr. Dexter was very smart. He married rich. In about 1880, his wife, who was worth about $125,000, gave him the money, and he was involved in real estate. However, Mr. Dexter wasn't very good in real estate, and according to the newspaper, squandered all his wife's fortune. And in about 1900, the house burned down, and they collected all the insurance money. Now, after that, Mr. Dexter went missing, and the trail went cold, until one day in 1902, a front page of the Daily Eagle said that he was found dead in Denver, Colorado, of all places. So after the house burned down, the land lay vacant for about another 20 years or so until Alfredo Palermo purchased the property and developed it and built the main home, and to the south the home of the butler and the maids. However, the Gorga family didn't buy that house, so that plan went awry, and the other home was sold separately. And you could see actually the very beautiful conservatory with amber windows. There's nothing that connects the home. There was never a tunnel, and there's no other interesting tales. I'm sorry. And here we are on 83rd Street between 11th and 12th Avenue, right before the dip happens in the hill here. And you could see in the distance about Coney Island. And it really helps you appreciate what it was like back in 1900 when Dyker Heights was first developed. You can see all the way Coney Island, the Sandy Hook, Staten Island right in front, the bay, the Narrows, and all the way up to about the Palisades. And you can appreciate, oh, there's the train goes by. where the flagpole is, that's about the Utrecht Reformed Church, was built in about 1828. But you can really understand what the viewpoint like, or the vantage point, especially for General de Russy, who built his house a few blocks away. You can see almost the entire bay of New York. And that's what made Dyker Heights absolutely stunning when it was first built. Not many trees, not many homes, beautiful crisp air from the bay, and an unrivaled vantage point. And here we are on 83rd Street at 1137, where the Jewett family once lived. However, obviously not the original home. And this is just an example of the new developments in Dyker Heights. And you can also see the change in not only the ethnicity of the community, but also in the architecture that they bring. Initially, Dyker Heights mainly was an Anglican community, and they built homes in the English tradition. And now we have an example of Italian style with Italian family. You can see the coins on the corners and the beautiful balustrades. And it's up to you guys to decide whether or not this is what we like. But it's definitely a high quality home. So Dr. Emmett Densmore purchased this house that I'm standing in front of in 1899 for $12,750. It was designed by Mr. Parfit, who was the first architect of Dyker Heights. The house cost Walter Johnson, the developer, about $7,000 to construct. So Mr. Densmore's family is very famous because they were very influential in designing the Densmore typewriter of all things. And he himself was actually very peculiar. He wrote a very strange bunch of books on sex equality and hygiene and whatnot. Anyway, his wife Helen died in the house in 1904, and then he moved to Manhattan. And Dr. Densmore's house was actually used in the film in Donnie Brasco, where the three guys run up the stairs and go in the basement, and then later on they were murdered. So now we're in front of the house purchased by H. Eck Moeller of the Anaconda Copper Mining Corporation. And it was built by Walter Johnson, designed by Constantine Schubert, who was the second architect of Dyker Heights, who actually lived down the block. This house cost Walter Johnson about $11,000 to build. I actually haven't been able to find how much Mr. Moeller actually paid for the house, but considering it cost $11,000 to build, he probably purchased it for about $15,000 to $20,000, which back in 1899 it was a considerable sum of money. So here we are in front of Constantine Schubert's home. He was, of course, the second architect of Dyker Heights. He purchased the lot here from Walter Johnson for about $2,400 and built a $7,000 house here. And he moved in about 1898. Since he moved out, we can see that the wraparound porch was enclosed, but if you look carefully on the chimney, you still have the S for Schubert. Now, Constantine Schubert was born in New York in about 1858, and he died in about 1925. And Constantine Schubert actually graduated from Cooper Union in about the late 1870s or the early 1880s. He was actually one of the few architects who established the New York Society of Architects in about 1907, of which he became the president in about 1913. And he was a member of the American Institute of Architects, and he was also a member of the Chess Congress, because he very much enjoyed chess. Mr. Schubert and a few others, Mr. Smith, who married Walter Johnson's sister, and another guy, Seaver, they would play chess on Thursday nights at the Dyker Heights Clubhouse. And here we are standing outside of 1169 85th Street, and George Dickinson, a cotton goods merchant, purchased this house from Walter Johnson for about $11,000 in 1900. The house, which has been significantly altered since it was built, was designed by Constantine Schubert, and I have a picture from about 1900 of it in black shingles, and recently it was in white shingles, and now we have these purple bricks. So as you can see, it's almost Christmas time here in Dyker Heights, and we're on the corner of 12th Avenue and 84th Street, and these two similar homes replace the home of Richard Perry Chittenden, who actually worked for the City Council of New York, and he purchased the home here, which was designed by Constantine Schubert in 1899 for about $15,000. And it was one of the largest homes that Walter Johnson built, and he actually used it in many of his advertisements to lure the Manhattan and Brooklynites to his clubhouse. Unfortunately, the home was very old, and it had a painful demise in about 1998. And here we are in front of 1144 84th Street, the home of Eugene E. Brocher. Mr. Brocher purchased this home from Walter Johnson in about 1899 for $12,000. So Mr. Brocher was born in England about 1862, but when he was 10 years old, his family moved to Messina, Italy, where he was schooled. He became very interested in both wine, art, and antiquity, but eventually found himself in New York in 1888 when he worked for Mutual Life Insurance Corporation. He eventually then became involved in longshoring and insurance as well. He and his wife, Bertha, who he married in about 1891, had 3 children. Unfortunately, she died after the 3rd child in 1901 in the house. After she died, he got involved with Italian opera singers and had them stay with him during the weeks of their performances in Manhattan. Eventually, he too died in January of 1925, and he's buried at Greenwood Cemetery. I also have a picture of his 2 daughters in the backyard, and you can see Mr. Chittenden's house in the background, and further back you can see all of Coney Island. Mr. Brocher was also an avid gardener and liked to water his garden with his son. Here we are standing outside of 8311 13th Avenue, and clearly these condos aren't original to Dyker Heights. The home that was torn down recently was actually built for $7,000 by Walter Johnson, designed by Schubert, and sold about 1899 to a man named Steve Carl Porter, who was actually a baritone vocalist, and he was very instrumental in the beginning of the recording studio back in the turn of the century. He actually has a patent on a type of hearing aid, as well as a type of record player that doesn't dull with age. And he actually established a company called the American Phonograph Record Company of Brooklyn in 1902, which was based on the idea of selling a record product that can record things on demand, as we're doing right now. Of course, unfortunately, the company went bankrupt, but his idea was perhaps 30 years too soon. Anyway, the home was demolished, unfortunately, and was replaced by these condos. And it's very important to talk about the replacement of homes here in Dyker Heights, because we once had a 1-family house, and based on the number of doors we have and the number of mailboxes, this is probably a 6-family house. So when you had only 1 toilet bowl flush every hour, now you have 6. You'll have 6 times the number of cars that need to find a parking spot. You'll have maybe even 6 times the number of children that need to go to public school. Yet in the community, we don't have 6 times the amount of sewage system, water supply, parking spots, and schools. So in the terms of urban design and development and planning, this is very important. So much so that the community board recognized that we can't demolish beautiful 1-family homes, even though they may be old and may need to be replaced, and replace them with condos. So downzoning of Dyker Heights as well as Bay Ridge ensued to make more contextual development that was also able better to reflect the infrastructure of the community. So here we are standing on the busiest corner in Dyker Heights on 86th Street and 13th Avenue, in front of what was the Dyker Heights Clubhouse and now home to the Knights of Columbus. So the Knights of Columbus acquired the property in about 1929 and renovated the neoclassical building, made it a little bit more bland, but they've been here ever since. The original building cost about $30,000 to build. The plot of land, which was 200 feet by 200 feet, cost Walter Johnson about $8,500, and it was the grand centerpiece at Dyker Heights. So it was a centerpiece of the development, not only because it was at the main intersection of the trolley line that took the residents from their homes all the way to Manhattan, because don't forget, there weren't any cars, nor were there a subway around. So that took residents to Manhattan to their jobs, but it was also home to Walter Johnson's real estate office. The pharmacy was downstairs. It had the first library inside, and it was also a center point of social activity for the people who lived here. In fact, bowling night, of course the bowling team was comprised of Schubert, Seaver, Smith, who was Johnson's brother-in-law, and Walter Johnson himself. They would play bowling in the basement on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday nights. Chess night was Thursday. Schubert was very involved in chess night, as we mentioned before. And the women, the wives of the community, put on a lot of plays on the grand ballroom on the top floor. And they also did card games and religious gatherings as well. In addition, the Marine and Field Club, whose clubhouse was on the water about a mile away, used the Dyker Heights Clubhouse as their offshoot when they played golf right across the street. The original golf course was a lot smaller than it is today, but they were the first people to play golf in the neighborhood. And actually every house in Dyker Heights had a phone that went from the butler's pantry to the butler's pantry here at the clubhouse. So when Mrs. Johnson wanted Walter back home, she'd pick up the phone and he knew he had to go home. And here we are at 1228 82nd Street in another example of recent renovations to original Dyker Heights homes. This home, which was about $4,500 100 years ago, can sell for a lot more today. And it is actually taking a home which was once Anglican with shingles and peaks and stained glass and turn it into more Mediterranean, as you can see with the arches, columns, and the clay roof. When they were renovating this house a few years ago, I took a picture and we can see the original black shingles, as you can see here in this beautiful 1900 photograph of when the home was first built. I guess it's your opinion whether or not you like the Mediterranean flair here in a very Anglican developed community. And here we are outside of 1246 82nd Street, and this is my favorite renovation because this home looks like what I think every home in this block looked like when Walter Johnson built it in about 1900. Very simple, wood, very stately, no stucco, no brick, and the owners of the house should be commended because it's quite wonderful. And you can see up the block here, which was actually the only block Walter Johnson was able to complete from avenue to avenue, that the homes are built on a lot of at least 60 by 100. They have to stand back 25 feet from the street, and they have to be of a certain size and caliber. Here we are at 1245 83rd Street, and you can see that the house behind me is undergoing significant renovation. And it gives us a rare opportunity to see what the homes looked like while they were being constructed 110 years ago. And you can see that the home had only wood. There wasn't any stone or cement. And actually this type of home with the three peaks is another type of home that was very common in Dyker Heights. So I'm assuming that the architect Constantine Schubert designed it. There's another home right up the block here that looks exactly like it. There's another one on 84th Street that looks exactly like this. So this is the second most popular model home in Dyker Heights. And from this vantage point, you could really appreciate the foundation of the homes. They were not poured concrete, but they were actually pieces of stone and cement mixed together. And actually in the front of the house, all the homes had a septic tank because when Dyker Heights was built, there weren't any sewers. So while they were excavating here, I bet if they looked hard enough, they can probably find an antique septic tank in the front of the house. And here we are outside of PS 201 in Dyker Heights. It opened for school in September of 1925. An extension was added in about 1936. And it's important in the story of Dyker Heights because the school was actually built on a very large pond. And depending on what map you looked at, the pond's name was either Floss Pond, Vlas Pond, or Flax Pond. Flax is an actual plant that's used to make linen as well as flaxseed oil. Hopefully we all take flaxseed oil. And the pond was quite large according to my map from 1868. It extended well beyond 80th Street, along 12th Avenue here, and well beyond 81st Street. And also the pond gave the name to the hill prior to Dyker Heights. So it was known as Floss Pond Hill. In addition, this is where King's Highway ran, as you can see in this map. It's called State Road. It ran just next to the pond before it went up over the hill. And ponds like this were very common all throughout Brooklyn. In fact, Century 21 was built on a pond, just like it. And actually, according to the Brooklyn Eagle, someone actually died in the pond. Supposed suicide by drowning. Last evening, the body of a man, apparently 45 years old, was found in Floss Pond, near Utrecht, by officers of the 48th Precinct, and removed to the morgue for inquest and identification. The body lay face downward in about 7 inches of water. The deceased is about 5 feet 5 inches high, light complexion, black hair, slightly mixed with gray, and chin adorned with a goatee. He wore light pants, red undershirt, outside shirt of small plaid, black ribbed coat, and vest. He's apparently a foreigner of recent arrival. And I remember a few years ago when I was walking home one day, I saw this apparition on the steps and it freaked me out. But later on when I was doing my research and I found this, it completely made sense. That's who it was, the guy who died in the pond. Here we are on the corner of 83rd Street and 12th Avenue, and during my research on Dyker Heights I came across a photo in the archives of the Brooklyn Public Library that said that actually this was the home for delinquent girls. The house was built in about 1900 for Mr. Jacob Mencken and designed by Constantine Schubert in a Spanish style, as we can see here. But by May of 1929, the National Council of Jewish Women opened this home as a home for delinquent girls. I'm not sure how the home came to them. Maybe upon Mr. Mencken's death, he bequeathed it to them. But by 1937, the home closed because it was no longer needed. However, it raises a good point that many of the homes here in Dyker Heights were in some capacity used for civic purposes, including down this next block here, first kindergarten in America for blind children. You must not think that blind children are mournful and sorrow and downhearted, said Mrs. Cynthia Westover Alden the other day when she heard a woman say, "Oh, blind children, I couldn't bear to see them. They must be so unhappy." "They are the jolliest little folks on earth," continued Mrs. Alden. "I've begun to think they're about the smartest." And here we are outside 1256 83rd Street, and you can see by the construction ahead of me, the home I'm about to talk about has been carted away in a dumpster and replaced with, well, whatever that is. It's important to the history of Dyker Heights, the home that preceded this, because although it was the original Dyker Heights home, it was used to house children who were blind. In 1900, the International Sunshine Society was incorporated by a very wealthy woman whose name was Cynthia Westover Alden, who received this home as a gift from the Dunn family in 1905 and established the first in America nursery and kindergarten for blind children here in Dyker Heights. The house here on 83rd Street was the kindergarten, and you can see from this photo from 1920 a few toddlers playing in the front yard. Now, immediately behind this home on 84th Street was a second home also owned by the International Sunshine Society, and that was the home for blind babies. And you can see from this photo, also from 1920, some children playing on the playground equipment. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were no schools for blind people who were younger than 8 years old. So when they reached the age of 8 and they went to school, it was very difficult for them to assimilate into class and to learn and to advance. Mrs. Alden understood this, and that's why she and a few of her colleagues established the first in America school for blind children as well as blind infants. I actually have a photo of Mrs. Alden caring for some blind children in a hammock, and you could tell she really loves the children, and she really loved what she did here at the International Sunshine Society for Blind Children. The children's favorite activities were actually playing in the orchestra, and I have a picture again from the balcony of the home next door, which shows them all playing many different instruments. In the background we can see is 13th Avenue. The middle house is that of Mr. Porter, which has been demolished many years ago. They actually were so good that they performed numerous times at the Hotel Astor in downtown Manhattan. Mrs. Alden did such a wonderful job caring for the home and the children that actually the State Board of Charities said that the Dyker Heights Home for Blind Children was the best one in the state, actually, at the time when it was still functioning. The entire institution was taken over by the New York City public school system in about 1955, and the home was purchased by St. Bernadette's for the nuns, and that was sold, and it laid vacant until obviously now we have this. The Dunn Cottage was designed by Constantine Schubert for Walter Johnson, and it was built about 1900. And this type of home was the most popular model home in Dyker Heights. There's been at least 4 or 5 others in Dyker Heights that looked exactly the same, because not every home in Dyker Heights was a custom-made home. But here in Dyker Heights, the very first school for blind children was where this home is now. The first meeting with parishioners was on July 18th, Thursday evening. At that meeting, I introduced myself, and while I was getting out a table, which was on the side of the altar, I did not see that underneath the table was the aspersorium for holy water, which of course I spilled all over the floor. I was not ashamed of this, as I saw encouragement from my audience, and so I remarked, "Ah, well, we've started out well with a good sprinkling of holy water, which should be a good omen," and it was. Here we are in front of the Shrine Church of St. Bernadette, which is actually the only church to her name in America, located on 83rd Street between 82nd and 83rd, and it really just reflects the change in the community, which was once Anglican-based going to an Episcopalian church, St. Phillips, to more Italian-American going to a Roman Catholic church. In June of 1935, Frances Barilla established the Shrine Church of St. Bernadette, who became a saint when in the south of France she had numerous visions of the Virgin Mary at grottos. And that's why we have a grotto here in the courtyard, and the church is built in the French Gothic tradition. And to raise money for the church, Mr. Barilla had a massive block party in August of 1935, which is a stark contrast to the Wayne parties of the parishioners of St. Phillips did about 40 years prior. The writer of this article, a dozen years ago, was practicing golf shots on the Dyker Beach links one day. He had difficulty getting his approaches up to the pin. A quick boy of about 12 years stood nearby. After the player had made a miserable showing, he handed the club to the lad and told him to try. With delicacy of touch worthy of Walter Hagen or Bobby Jones, the boy dropped shot after shot on the green close to the pin. As the player was leaving, he said to the lad, "Boy, when you go home, tell your papa and mama they ought to get you a set of clubs, as you'll make a fine player." The boy began to cry softly. The player asked another lad why he was crying. "Because," he said, "he has no mother and no father. He's an orphan at the Norwegian children's home over there." And he pointed to a large building. The player felt so mortified at having caused the boy's tears that the next day he sent anonymously to the home a full set of clubs fitted to the boy's size. Whether the boy has developed into a great golfer, the player does not know. But he has always had a warm spot in his heart for the Norwegian children's home, which could turn out so well-dressed, well-mannered, and vigorous a young lad as a little player. In May of 1909, the Norwegian Children's Association of New York was established by a Norwegian community that recognized the need for an orphanage because many of the adult Norwegians were either at sea or lost at sea and there was no one around to take care of the children. So in March of 1912, they purchased land at 43 Governor Street, which actually is now part of the golf course, for $6,500. And on January 1st, 1915, the $25,000 building opened to 10 children and 2 babies. It had a gymnasium and a kitchen and obviously many dormitories. However, in the 1920s, Dyker Beach Golf Course moved north from 92nd Street to 86th Street, and eminent domain captured that building. However, the proceeds from that purchase helped move them to Dyker Heights, and they purchased this 200 by 200 foot piece of property at 1355 84th Street for $25,000, and they built the building behind me, which opened in November of 1932 for about $100,000, and it was able to accommodate 75 children. However, when it opened, it only had 56 kids, and the orphanage actually continued throughout the decades up until the 80s and early 90s, when the Norwegian Children's Home Association no longer had a need for an orphanage, and they sold the property and the building behind me to a developer who built all these homes and turned the building behind me into condos. The proceeds from that sale actually helped fund the scholarship, which is used for children who are applying to college who have at least one descendant of Norwegian ancestry. Actually, as a kid, I remember my mom would threaten me when I was misbehaving that she was going to drop me off at the Norwegian Children's Home. And when it closed, I was very happy. And here we are outside of the Saida House, 1135 84th Street. And this is the only house in Dyker Heights that has been virtually unchanged since it was built in 1899. The home has been beautifully preserved and restored by Frank and Irene Santo. The house was originally built for Simone and Beatrice Saida. The land cost $2,700 and the house cost $15,000 to build, a substantial sum of money 110 years ago. Notice the pair of S's on the front gates here for Simone Saida. Now, Mr. Saida was born in Palermo, Sicily in about 1859. He came to America in 1889 when he quickly established himself in the produce business, and he was known as the Lemon King of America. He was responsible for importing 1/4 of all lemons to America, as well as 1/4 of all grapes. Now, the architect wasn't Parfit, who was the first at Dyker Heights, nor was it Schubert, who lived down the block, and he was the second architect at Dyker Heights, but actually a man by the name of John J. Petit. Now, Mr. Petit designed this in the English style with the Tudor decorations, with the false half timbering, as well as some of the beautiful quatrefoils underneath the windows on the 3rd floor. On the western face of the house is a very large 3-story tower that afforded the viewer an uninterrupted panorama all the way from Sandy Hook to the Palisades. Now, once Mr. Petit designed this house, he took what he learned and he applied it to a whole series of homes built by Dean Avalord in Prospect Park South. Many of them have been landmarked, and the entire neighborhood is one major historic district. So he took what he learned here and he applied it to all those homes down there. Now, the house was so beautiful and so admired in the architectural community that it was featured as the cover home in the June 1901 edition of Scientific America Building Edition, which later on became known as Better Homes and Gardens. There were many homes in Dyker Heights featured in these magazines, but this was the only one that was on the cover. It was a big honor. The inside of the house has been virtually unchanged since 1899. 6-foot wainscoting, exposed beautiful beams, elaborate woodwork everywhere, and 5 fireplaces, all different. The magazine also featured an additional photo of the house from the eastern side, and you could see Mr. Saida sitting on the front steps smoking a pipe. In addition, they presented the reader with 2 floor plans of the first and second stories, and you can see that these rooms were massive. They had multiple fireplaces, exposed woodwork. It was really a wonder of architecture, and it's been beautifully preserved for 110 years. So Mr. Saida sold the house in 1924 to a business associate, Francesco M. Ferrari, who's a banker in Manhattan. Mr. Ferrari's grandson was able to contact me for the Dyker Heights Civic Association website, and he was kind enough to share stories, photos, and even videos of his house in the 1920s. Francesco Maria Ferrari was born in 1885 outside of Naples, Italy. He was married in 1910, and by 1912 he was in America, earning $9 a week in the steam shipping industry. But by 1913 he was involved in his first bank, Banca di Vita, on 108th Street, 1st Avenue in Harlem. By 1919 he applied for his license to open up his own private bank, and by 1921, with the help of Congressman LaGuardia, he received his first private bank license, Banca Ferrari, 2nd Avenue, 109th Street in Harlem, and it was geared towards Italian immigrants. And he was very popular in Harlem, known as Francesco the Magnificent. He was the official orator of the community, president of both Sons of Italy as well as the Italian Hospital on 5th Avenue. He became friendly with Beniamino Gigli, an opera singer, who helped him raise funds for the hospital. By 1923, he petitioned Congressman LaGuardia to turn his private bank into a state bank, and by 1925, it was born, the Harlem Bank of Commerce. That same year, he purchased the Saida House from Mr. Saida for $60,000. He was so well respected in the community. On the day in 1927 when his youngest son was born, he had many visitors come to his house in Dyker Heights. Mr. Vanderbilt, Mr. Guggenheim, and even the New Jersey governor, Arthur Harry Moore. And when his youngest son was baptized at St. Finbar in Bath Beach by Beniamino Gigli, the opera singer who we can see here leaning over his mom on the photo, he held a very large, extravagant party in his house. Many visitors were there. Not only was Beniamino Gigli there, but New York Governor Al Smith, Congressman LaGuardia, and even Simone Saida, who was kind enough to stay for this family portrait. And you can see Mr. Saida in this photo on the top left, next to his daughter. And Mr. Ferrari was kind enough to share with us this home video of Mr. Ferrari taking Mr. Saida from the front of the house to the back where the party was. Mr. Ferrari loved having parties in his home, parties which rival those of the Great Gatsby. And the press loved them too, and they would report on them all the time. Quote, once he invited all of us to a wedding banquet in his Brooklyn house. The feasting lasted from 2 in the afternoon till 3 o'clock the following morning. One course followed another, with leisurely intervals in between. Pasta, ice cream, roast chicken, fruit, fish, a different sort of pasta, turkey, cakes, shrimps, pasta again, soup, roast beef, cassata, boiled meats, and so on, indefinitely without any discernible plan. Occasionally musicians accompany a singer on guitars and mandolins. An impromptu orator delivered a whiny eulogy of the bride and groom, or the host, or an amateur poet read an ad hoc composition with a few lame lines. The guests were not supposed to stay put in the same place. Some ambled around the house and garden, took naps on sofas, sat in other rooms to chat, telephoned, sang choruses, washed their faces in the bathroom, came back to the table to taste the latest offering, a bit of fried fish, a sfogliatella, or a forkful of spaghetti with clam sauce. As Mr. Ferrari became more influential, he and some investors purchased 15 Park Row for $4 million. It was the world's largest building in the end of the last century. By 1926, he purchased his second state bank, the Atlantic State Bank of Brooklyn. And in 1927, Italian King Victor Emmanuel III proclaimed him the Commendatore of Italy for his distinguished service to Italian Americans. In 1928, his two state banks merged and became the City Trust Company. On Friday, February 1st, 1929, he died suddenly from an appendicitis. His funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral. But by March of 1929, on the heels of the Great Depression, the City Trust Company collapsed. Thankfully, due to the work ethic of his board, all of the depositors that put money in the City Trust Company had it refunded by the fall of 1929. And in February 1929, all of the Italian-American newspapers reported on the death of Mr. Ferrari. And you can see here from a newspaper clipping shows the casket being carried outside of the Saida House to an 84th Street that was blocked from traffic. As the hearse took Mr. Ferrari from the Saida House to St. Patrick's Cathedral, it was followed by 15 flower cars and over 100 limousines. And there was standing room only at St. Patrick's Cathedral to pay respects to Mr. Ferrari. The current owners, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Santo, did such a wonderful job restoring the house that the Dyker Heights Civic Association, in conjunction with the Dyker Heights Historical Society, was able to list the house on both the State and National Register of Historic Places. Well, that concludes our historical tour of Dyker Heights. I hope that Angelo Bonsignore, the filmmaker and fellow Dyker Heights native, and I were able to bring to life the people of the neighborhood. And I hope you had a better appreciation of what life was like back 110 years ago. And I hope you were able to understand that Dyker Heights was the pinnacle of high society, with the high ground, magnificent ocean view, and careful restrictions placed upon the property by Walter Johnson. If you have any questions, or if you have any videos or pictures or any other historical information you want to share with me, please email me at historian@dykerheightscivicassociation.com, or you can go onto that website and view my webpage, or you can even find us on Facebook. How was that, Angelo?
Great.
You look good? I mean, that was like 3 times it took us to do it. It feels so great that it's done. Listen, my mom made us some Zeppelis and cappuccino. We should go across the street and go get them.
All right, buddy. Let's go. Get that wire up. Good work.
Thanks. Ma, we'll be right there.